This is Janie from Tax Free 15 with researcher and author William Stuart. Now, William's latest book, which is called 911 to Armageddon, has just been published. So we're just going to touch on a few points from his book. A good place to begin is finding out just how wars actually start. Now, most people believe that wars are a result of things like, say, a breakdown in diplomacy or talks, or a border dispute, or responding to a perceived or real attack. I think most people will be really, really shocked to discover that wars are actually planned in a cold and calculating way by a small criminal minority. So these people have actually sat down and planned the murder and suffering of countless millions over the years. So let's get down to basics, William, and find out just who these people are and what their agenda is.
The answer to that is surprising because it goes back to 697 when a central bank was created in Venice with various agents attached to it. And what we do know is that over hundreds of years, this bank arranged a variety of different wars, as well as the sort of slaving and currency manipulation and so forth. And we do find them at work in the Eastern Mediterranean from that early date, eventually spreading through into Europe. And it's a central bank which hides itself in what we call Red Masonry or Templar lodges. The reason they're called Templar lodges is because this organization took over the Templars in 1099 and turned them into the occultists that they became. So what we've got is this movement from Venice into the Eastern Mediterranean, then slowly up into Europe. The organization is really a central bank which likes to cause our wars. And that is done for two reasons. First of all, for profit, making money, arms supplies and so forth to both sides. And secondly, to make conquest of lands and governments and to exploit them once they have fallen.
So what we're talking about is a group of people who are basically asset stripping and working to a particular structure.
Yes, they are. I believe I've mentioned this in a previous broadcast, but they plan what they're going to do 120 years before they act. So for that reason, it's extremely difficult to find out who did things. And when you begin to get on the trail, the people responsible are already dead. And they work really through the grandson. So it's probably the grandfather who does the planning, and then you get the various workings up to the event, and it's the grandson who triggers the event. I've got numerous instances of this, and it surprised me as much as it will surprise your listeners.
You say 120 years. Is this a set figure? Why is there a magical reason for 120 years apart from the fact that the original planner will be dead?
Well, there is, yeah. I mean, it appears in Fama Fraternitatis, which is one of their secret documents, and it mentions that in 120 years a door will open. And you do get it, first of all, in there. What it represents is the time when these bankers, you call them Lombards, Italian bankers, a time when they were driven out of Europe and driven out of Britain for bankrupting it. And they spent, roughly speaking, 120 years in exile, being kept contained in Venice. So that's the reason for the 120 years. It's a kind of revenge. It makes them feel right in what they're doing, I suppose.
Is it sort of like a little joke on their part, really?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty sick joke, but it is a joke. But they do that because we'll be coming on to probably just discussing a little bit another joke that they have, which is to take the Book of Revelation, which has 7 great crises in it, which are called the breaking of seals. They call their company after the author of that last book of the Bible, Revelation. They call it the John Company. They also make up their rituals from the Book of Revelation, that's the last book of the Bible, and they match the 7 particular wars to the Book of Revelation, to the breaking of the seals. So there is some idea of what they're like. They turn good into evil, evil into good, as it were. So they will tell their little jokes.
Right, you talked about 7 seals, and that equates to 7 wars. So where did these wars start, and what was the first war?
There have been a number of wars, right the way going back in history, of course, and the 30 Years' War was one of theirs. But I want to bring it right up to the present, or let us say the 1700s, and just begin there because that's when the strategic wars start, and it's the moment when the central bank in Venice sent out an agent, a main agent, who was part of the family bank called Antonio Conti. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what Conti arranged. We're going back into 1700s, and history does not cover any of this, and history will have another version, but I can't help that. This is simply part of my research and what I have found out. Now, in 1730, Agent Conti, opened the Boston Lodges. He did so in conjunction with Isaac Newton, who was working inside the Bank of England, who was the Grand Master of Zion, or of the Templars, and foreign shareholders in the Bank of England, that is, joined in to assist this process. Now, the Bank of England at that time, which of course is now a reformed bank, but at that time it had been founded by the Lombards and was working in link with Geneva, which was, again, a centre for all this, and Geneva was working in link with Venice. So their agent arrived in Britain, and one of the things he did in 1730 was to open these Templar lodges. These are the lodges that set off the American War of Independence, which is their first strategic war. And they did so in conjunction with banking. Then we move to actually a little bit before that in 1713, and Conti was at work in France, founding all kinds of secret lodges there. One of these lodges trained Voltaire, and Voltaire was to meet with both Conti and Benjamin Franklin, who helped to set off the American War of Independence, in the Nine Sisters Lodge in Paris. And this was one of the major sort of espionage bases for the Lombard process. So we can trace what became the French Revolution straight back to Conti and to the Nine Sisters Lodge of Paris. Later on, the French Revolution was set off by Lord Shelburne, and there are still documents in the British Museum to show this. And he triggered the French Revolution, which was going to be Seal II, or War II. As I say, the fiery letters of Shelburne and his assistants stoking up revolution are in the British Museum. Now, Lord Shelburne, again the 1700s, was the chairman of what is called the East India Company, which of course is part of Lombard control. The whole company belonged to them. So now we have some very solid and suspicious facts around the French Revolution. Then in 1740, I think it's about 1740 to about 1750, the de Saussure family, who came from Frontenac's castle in Geneva, moved to South Carolina, and they were actually agents of this whole process at that time. So what you find is that the family settles in South Carolina, and it's Daniel, the grandson of the family, who kept in constant contact with Frontenac's castle. It is he who helped to trigger and steer the American Civil War. Now we've got another agent who's called Mazzini, always worked in the 1800s, following Conti in the 1700s, and Mazzini went over to America and worked at presidential level to make sure that the American Civil War occurred. So that was a war of great butchery with the Astors on one side, the Rothschilds on the other, and both of these two founded the Round Table. From Russia, which again is going to be our third war, we discover that the East India Company's secret society, which is called Fratres Lucis, was operating in Russia in the 1700s. So although we can't exactly have the same process and say this agent did that, both Conti and Mazzini and their agents were at work in Russia. Throughout the 1800s, Mazzini put his agents into Russia, somebody called Pappas, who was an agent, and the agent of Martinism, and Synoky, which is basically the right wing dominating the left wing process. And so we know that it was all there. But what happened in that particular war, which helped me to put my pictures together, was that the Russian Revolution actually began to fail because the peasants remained, and the people remained, loyal to the Tsar. And so what had to happen was there had to be some direct intervention. And intervening in the process of the Russian Revolution was Rothschild, J.P. Morgan, Kung Loeb Company, Warburg, Rockefeller, and also the American International Company, AIC. And Jacob Schiff, who was Kung Loeb, that's one of the big bankers in America who are linked to this system at that time, which became Lehman Brothers. He actually had the Tsar murdered. So there we see for the first time something surfacing quite clearly. In the American Civil War, you get the Round Table forming as a result of that war in Britain, which again conducts further wars. But then you get these names attached to the war that was planned for Russia.
You've briefly skimmed over both the American War of Independence and the Civil War in America. And I know you have a lot of listeners in the United States. So can we just go back over that, William? I think a lot of Americans hold to the view that the reason that the War of Independence started was because they were being governed by England, they were paying taxes to England, and they were being made to purchase and import goods from England rather than making it themselves. So how does that relate to these bankers and their agents?
Well, firstly, they had a number of shareholders. Pretty much all the shareholders in the Bank of England were of foreign kind. And these bankers went out of their way deliberately to affect American money. There are one or two other things that they did, but generally speaking, they helped that war to trigger. The relationships between America and Britain were always excellent, and it was only at a certain point when they were being troubled, apparently by Britain, that we moved towards the possibility of conflict. The second thing that happened was not just the Bank of England doing this, well, that really is a major factor. The second thing is they founded something called the Hellfire Clubs, and the British Army, the British Navy were represented in the Hellfire Club, including the American main agents. So they were all meeting together in the Hellfire Clubs, and these were then linked across into France, into the Nine Sisters Lodge. So you've got a system of espionage in which even Benjamin Franklin was initiated into Red Masonry, and that Red Masonry drove the Hellfire Clubs and drove the Nine Sisters Lodge. So you've got a form of Red Masonry created, which again is part of the process of causing that war. The reason it happened, that is the American Civil War, because Britain had over 50 or more years had been trying to reform the East India Company, which was the main Lombard presence in England. And the government of Britain was beginning to attack it, and they saw the warning signs and were looking for a new place to go and a new country to infect. So you get these various little bits of information coming together and showing what actually happened. On the surface, the wars between America and Britain. Under the surface, it was all started by these central bankers, and the object was to try to take over America. So that's what happened. If you wanted just to sort of fill in a little bit of detail, I'll just say of the American Civil War, what the Lombards tried to do there was basically take on America and beat America. So there was a stunning victory in which they were pushed backwards. Didn't stop them eventually using the peace years to create their central banking in America. But nevertheless, they wanted to split America in half, joining the southern states to South America. And then after they split America, they then wanted to go into the attack again and take over all of it. But the American Civil War was a little bit like the Battle of Britain. The right side won, and won fairly decisively, because we know what was behind it. The President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was shot dead because of the way he wanted money to be independent of the Lombards. So he lost his life in the same way as Kennedy over exactly the same issue.
I interrupted you mid-flow when you were working your way through the various wars, so you got to Russia. So you carry on with that, William.
It needs to be read. You need to read the book. I know we're covering such a lot of information over such a sort of broad passage of time. It's very difficult to put it into words. And in a way, the book does it logically, whereas I'm just trying to give an overall picture without too much detail. So we've come to Germany, and we've had two very surprising wars there. Conti went over to Berlin in somewhere around between 1713 and 1715. And he was hard at work there with the Berlin Red Lodges, the Rosicrucians, Templar Lodges, for anything up to 2.5 years. And although we don't get much of an insight into what was going on there, what we can say very clearly is that in 1781, the lodges that actually set off World War II were being activated in Austria. And all the exact lodges that Hitler used were set up in 1781. There's quite a lot one could say about the German war, and I'm not going to get too drawn on that, but Hitler, when it came to appointing a corporal, and the SS leader was a chicken farmer, when it came to putting them into office, Lambach Abbey in Austria already had the Nazi swastikas set up in it since about 1865. Hitler was recruited into Lambach Abbey, and within the space of a few months, the Grand Master of the Templars, who is also called Liebenfels, the father of German socialism, came to see him there. And later on, when the secret societies were set up in Germany, or rather when they were all activated, because they'd already been set up, the Grand Master of the Templars was one of those major groups. So you can see that, that there are a whole lot of suspicious stuff. I have drawn that together in a book which will be out, in a few months' time, about the Nazis and that era. Mazzini follows Conti, and what you find in Switzerland, and it's always Switzerland, I assure you, was the Lehman conspiracy, or Young Germany, and what Mazzini did was to train up revolutionaries, occult revolutionaries, because if you know the Third Reich, you know the occult, and he sent them back in streams back to Austria and back to Germany. There's another group in Britain, which I've called the English Cell, and that too was training up people and sending them all over Europe to carry out their various functions to make sure that World War occurred. We know a little bit more about the Second World War simply because it's in recent history. The information is there, and the information was buried. World War I was started in 1711, and what happened was an agent of the British East India Company went over to Saudi Arabia and founded what became the Muslim Brotherhood. He also founded, and it's in the script, he also founded occult lodges all over the Middle East. So this Muslim Brotherhood arose in power when they wanted it to, which was to cause World War I by breaking up the Ottoman Empire. And that Ottoman Empire was being manhandled and manipulated anyway by the said bankers. So we can account for World War I, we can account for World War II, we can produce the data on it, and we can say that the same lodges, the same bankers, the same central bank, the same sort of industrial military complex were involved in the 7 strategic wars. What World War II brought us, of course, was the European Union, and the bankers who created the European Union are the same bankers who planned Nazism and communism in 120 to 140 Broadway, New York.
Just going back to World War II, there's a lot of evidence that certain corporate leaders such as Averell Harriman and Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, were involved in supporting Hitler, helping to build up his empire.
Yeah, that's a part of it, and that's perfectly true. And that link goes to the Dutch banks and then through into Germany. And the funding was coming again from the bankers. As I said, it's 120 to 140 Broadway, which is a group of 6 bankers operating from New York. The important point to recognize there is that these bankers are more or less controlled. I don't think they own the money that they so lavishly spend. And they are linked through into the round table groups in Britain and to the round table groups across Europe and into Switzerland. So there's a big group of bankers, European, Russian, German, British and American, who know perfectly well what they have done. So there was a swill of money, and then also supplies of armaments and ammunition. And indeed, Rockefeller Standard Oil supplied oil to the Third Reich all the way through the Second World War. So there's quite a lot to look at there. What you end up with is being quite certain that money was behind the whole process, and when they got rid of Hitler and the Nuremberg trials erased the rest of them, you still had the bankers who did the paying, who did the planning as of the 1700s, still intact, still untouched and much, much richer.
And basically they went scot-free.
They went completely scot-free. They must have known then, I think, some people, but we know who they are. And they got away with it completely, yes. And when the shutters come down and the secrecy starts, of course, that generation, we're talking of the 3 generations now, or 120 years, that generation's already dead. And so all the links go back to them and then seem to be lost.
So that accounts for 6 wars that all seem to have the same sort of structure within them.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
So there's one missing.
There's one missing.
So,
There's one missing. And so we have 6 wars, 6 seals. We've got war number 7 to come. And we can just remind ourselves of how that starts. It'll start 120 years before it happens. So if you take a strategic date like 9/11, then you count back 120 years and you end up with 1881. And what I'd like to do now is very briefly, and I know it's all a bit complicated, but we're going to look very briefly at 1881.
well, what was significant about 1881?
Right, well, first of all, I want to just talk about a little link between 9/11 and 1881. So I'm going to talk about September the 11th. Why September the 11th? Why did that occur in the United States of America twice? The first time was when 11 states in America tried to kick the Red Lodges or the Templar Lodges and the bankers out of America altogether. And this group of anti-Masons, as they called them, but of course it wasn't Freemasonry, it was Red Masonry, they met each September the 11th for at least 10 years and tried to remove the Lombards and the Red Lodges from America. We've got to remember that at the same time, if you think of the connections, the Muslim Brotherhood, which belonged to the bankers, had been set up in the Middle East. So there's a little sort of sideways link. And we can start this 1881 with the fact that the Red Masons and their bankers murdered a Mr. Morgan around 1830. He was one of the leaders of anti-Masonry. And very curiously, his body was discovered in 1881. So you get a kind of jolt whereby it's almost as if somebody's saying to America, I'm warning you, that was our judgment and there's more to come. The Lombards, Red Lodges, judge humanity thinking themselves to be John of Patmos. And I can produce the degrees which show that that is the case. So they're really judging America, I believe, for September the 11th in the attempts to get rid of them and to remove their banking system and all the problems that they had caused. 1881 was when the bankers, who had been kicked out of Britain, incidentally, in 1874 with the closure of the East India Company, returned to Britain. This nasty group, which became Round Table, came back to Britain. It came through to create the Fabian Society, Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, formed first of all by the German Rothschilds, Astors and Bate. And the Round Table turned out to be a war-making organisation, of course, because we see where it came from. It came from the bankers. And it set off the Boer War and the Russian Revolution. It spread into America as a splinter of Round Table called the CIA, not the main CIA, but a splinter of it, the Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg, and Trilateral Commission, which currently fall to the Rockefellers, but to the bankers. So you've got forming a cell in America, a cell in Britain, which is called Round Table. And this all came from the 1881 return of the Lombards to Britain through something called the Sidgwick Group, which then morphed into the Round Table groups. Today, the links between these two groups are called BAP, the British-American Project, and you'll find at one end is the Round Table in Britain, at the other end is the Round Table in America, and the British one links into the European Union. So you've got this not a government organisation, very rich, very powerful, a horrible background, which is operating today. So there you've got, something quite significant in 1881. You've got the war-making groups returning to Britain and then moving and strengthening their position in America. 1881, a new and very virulent form of Red Templar Masonry was created, used to hide all the goings-on, and it is called the Ancient and Primitive Rite. Now, this was circulated in the Middle East, so we know that a war-making rite was added to all the other things that we've had in the Middle East since 1710, and the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood. So obviously the Muslim Brotherhood that is affected by this catches hold of the Ancient and Primitive Rite.
So the three groups that we know about, the Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderbergs, and the Trilateral Commission, you're saying is actually linked to a splinter group of the CIA?
Yes, I mean, as you know, CIA does good work for America. There are a lot of great patriots in it. They did some very good work. Some of them did some very good work. around the time of 9/11, but unfortunately some of them did not. And what the Lombards do is they take our main institutions, including intelligence units, and they split them so that you've got what you know about and then something hidden underneath. The Fabians was a very good example of this. For instance, it had utopian left wing on the outside, which founded the Labour Party. Inside it was run by the most extreme, radical, rancid bankers, the Society of the Elect. So you get the idea. And yes, there is a link between the splinter that they've created of the CIA and Rockefeller's relative who created the CIA, and then the Rockefeller groups, which are, as you say, Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg and Trilateral Commission.
Well, I'll let you get back to 1881. What else was significant?
Right, in 1881 too, so it was going on in 1882, begun in 1881, Baron Edmund Rothschild was working with what are called radical Zionists. Now, these are people who outwardly want the state of Israel to exist and to be reasonably right-wing. But Zionism itself can be traced back into the young movement of the Lombards. So really speaking, 1881, Baron Edmund Rothschild met with Lombard planning for right-wing activity in the Middle East to try to set up, if you like, young Israel or a right-wing Israel state. He contacted Rabbi Samuel, and I'll call him Rabbi Samuel because I can't even begin to pronounce the second name, but he's Rabbi Samuel. Rabbi Samuel was expecting Armageddon, that's the seventh war, a final battle of Armageddon to take place, after which a new nation, Israel, would arise and conquer all the areas around it as found in the Old Testament. And I have to ask you what Mr. Rothschild banker was doing, organizing in such a volatile region with people who actually wanted Armageddon. Now, I put in the book there are other rabbis and so forth on the same tack. But of course, we are dealing with a radical organization which is banker-based. It is nothing to do with the state of Israel. And those are perfectly genuine, good, nice people in Israel who have nothing to do with this. Now, we'll have to return a little bit and try to fit these things together. In 1881, Western bankers began to take control of the Ottoman Empire. And don't forget, there's the Ottoman Empire, that's the breakup of it by the Muslim Brotherhood, owned by our bankers that caused World War I. Then the war-making round table, which we've talked very briefly about, which was the Lombards coming back to Britain and going to America, having been kicked out of Britain. They were fresh from causing the Boer War and the Russian Revolution a bit later on. They took charge of the process of creating the State of Israel at the Paris Peace Conference of 2nd of November 1919. And it was called the Balfour Declaration, after somebody who was sort of attached, as it were, to the British government. But unfortunately, the bankers were using the Milner Round Table, the one that did the Boer War and later the Russian Revolution, and so on, to create the State of Israel. And this truth did not come out until the 21st of July 1936, as released by parliamentarian Ormsby Gore. So you tell me what the war makers were doing setting up a State of Israel that wanted and expected Armageddon, being founded by the most profound war makers on earth.
So William, does that make the foundation of the State of Israel a little bit sinister?
No, it doesn't really, because the State of Israel came together involving in the main some very good people who, many of them had a very bad time in Europe. They wanted their own state, and there's no particular reason why they shouldn't have one. What was sinister was the thing that was underneath it, which had not become clear. And later on, this Lombard pressure would be called the Irgun, the right-wing aspect of Israel, the bit that wanted to take over other areas, and that is really the sinister bit. That's why we've got trouble in the Middle East. We can't pin things down and find out where they're coming from. So it's not the State of Israel. It's something underneath it.
Well, from some of the reading I've done, you're saying that the Jews had a bad time, yes, but I have seen that Hitler was actually encouraged to make the life of Jewish people in Germany rather intolerable, initially intolerable, before he started using the concentration camps, in order to try and make Jews want to voluntarily leave the country and go to Israel.
That is very true, and the first plan was to send them to Madagascar, and that continued right the way through before they actually started to kill them. This is absolutely correct. I mean, there were other forces at work. For instance, the Russian pogroms against the Jews, which were conducted really with very vicious attacks on them, making them guilty for things that they had not done, for assassinations, for instance. So that the move against the Jews was much more than Hitler. It was quite profound, and I do believe that they hope very much to set up something for some reason. I agree with you.
Okay, so let's go back to 1919.
Right, well, 1919, you begin to see a little bit of planning going on. At the planning of the State of Israel, Paris Peace Conference, was somebody called Untermeyer, who was a part of blackmailing President Wilson and also Prime Minister Lord Lloyd George. He was doing that on behalf of the arms trade and the bankers, of course. His blackmail led to the appointment of Justice Brandeis, who took America into World War I. And remember, World War I had been planned from 1710 in Saudi Arabia. He was also the man who hired somebody called Schofield. And Schofield produced the Armageddon Bible. It's called the Schofield Bible. And what that does is to suggest that Armageddon, the seventh war in the book of Revelation, the seventh seal, that this is somehow inevitable, that it's a physical war, and that it's going to take place in Israel. So here you've got a Bible backing up what the Rothschilds did in 1881. The Bible was incidentally completed in 1881, and the Bible suggests a physical war to happen in the Middle East, in Israel. The Paris Peace Conference, of course, made its decisions and reported back to the Rothschilds, and its decisions were obviously helped by the fact the arms trade were blackmailing the English Prime Minister and also the American President. So now you've got the prospect of War 7 being formed, and you can find evidence that this is the case. You'll see that the Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Trilaterate in the USA, hope to control foreign affairs in America and the military, as well as having people like White House President Carter in the Trilaterate Commission itself. So you see, foreign affairs and a lot of what happens can be influenced by people who have never been elected and who have an actual agenda. And because people don't know about the agenda, they will not be able to explain what is happening in an area, for instance, like the Middle East. So there you've got just some cases of 1881, and these issues will then dovetail into things that happen a bit later on.
So let's talk about Armageddon Masonry. How does that all come in then?
Here, Armageddon Masonry, which belongs to the Red Lodges that I've been talking about, which belong to the Lombard bankers, who are now operating from Venice, Geneva, and presumably from their round table in Britain and their round table in America, as indeed in the modern world from elsewhere. You could hop over to the Cayman Islands in 5 seconds. But here we've got Armageddon Masonry, and it is attached to these secretive lodges that are run by bankers. Now, you might say you must be stark raving mad to come across with an idea like Armageddon Masonry. That is the deliberate creation of 7 strategic wars. But I suppose in a way the culprits, the bankers, must have slipped up a little bit in that Armageddon Masonry is described in various books. It is, for instance, in the dictionary of A.E. Waite, a dictionary of Freemasonry. There you will find that and 7 seals described at the same time. So it's not such a guess after all. There is such a thing. They are working to this plan, and I have found it. Lombard agent Conti, who was really basically behind the initial structures in the 1700s, was a defrocked priest, as many of these agents were actually. They operated the central bank of Venice. They were in the church. They did unpleasant things and were thrown out. So there you've got a defrocked priest who knows every word of the Bible and who has decided that one of the big jokes will be to use the book of Revelation to savage Europe, America, and Britain. I'm going to talk just now about what I have found. Now, you note that when Israel was founded, the Rothschilds were recruiting Armageddon, people who actually believed that the state of Israel needed Armageddon before it could spread to the territories that it should have. That's not talking about or average Israelis or families or their government. We're talking about something that actually happened, but it was separate from what you'd expect. In the Middle East, there are numerous lodges of the Templars, founded in Saudi Arabia in 1710, exported to Turkey and other nations. And here, people trained to see good as evil, evil as good, and they planned to conduct the strategic wars I've talked about And we have their statement of Mazzini and Albert Pike, an American Red Mason, on 3 world wars, which they discussed in some detail. So first of all, Armageddon looks very possible simply because you've got these lodges spread throughout the Middle East. Then you've got the Hamas Armageddon. Again, this is a branch, although they say it isn't. It is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded by the East India Company, founded by the Lombard bankers. It's from the Islamic resistance movement, which taught Gog and Magog, which is basically saying Armageddon, the killing of Jews and the Arabs' apocalyptic rise to full power. Palestine to them is a religious trust consecrated for Muslim use until Judgment Day, when the Jews and the Arabs will fight. So deep down inside Hamas, you've not only got the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is the thing that took the Jews into the Holocaust. Then there's the Israeli Armageddon. This comes mainly today through the right wing of Israel, the Irgun, Gog and Magog again, the Armageddon in Israel, which is an apocalyptic war in which Israel would rise to new power in the region. Members actually wish for this return of God and a religious battle. All of Palestine, etc., would be theirs. And such agents were, of course, supported by the main mega or main bankers, including the Rothschilds. Then there's one you don't know about, perhaps, and that's the Christian Armageddon. And Christians have been trained to the Schofield Bible, which says we've got to have rapture and we've got to have Armageddon, it's coming soon. In 2002, 371 of them were sent to Israel. They expected to create a Jewish state, one suitable and ready to experience the second coming of Jesus as the act of Armageddon. And the Schofield Bible was, of course, their guide to this, but then the Schofield Bible was made by the mega bankers. In 1991, a large meeting of such Christians took place in Basel, Switzerland, where they announced the near presence of the second coming called Armageddon. So don't let's say that we're dealing with something that is not provable. There is an occult lodge Armageddon, Hamas, Israelis, and Christian. And then we deal with the Schofield Armageddon, which again is a Bible circulating, the most popular in America. It doesn't circulate in any other place, I don't think, or not to such an extent. And they taught a physical battle of Armageddon in Megiddo, west of Jordan. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem was to be destroyed, causing an unstoppable religious war. At that point, the third temple of the Jews would be built on that spot. And the third temple actually is mentioned in the Schofield Bible. Now, of course, they've made all this up. Since then, to this very day, there have been attempts to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and also plans have been made by major occultists to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. The last sort of fracas was on February the 24th, 2012, not very long ago, to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to rebuild the temple. Planners they're either American gangsters with mega contacts in the background, with other people doing the front work.
So just to recap, in the Hamas, the Islamic view, in the Jewish Israeli view, and in the Christian, they are all wanting to have this Armageddon war right in Israel, Palestine.
Oh, absolutely. And if you take the Christian part of it, we can trace that back to Jacob Schiff, who paid for the Armageddon Bible. He is one of the 6 big bankers in America who, as I say, are linked through elsewhere. If we go to Saudi Arabia, they call it Wahhabism, but I haven't called it that. I've called it Hemphorism, after the agent who created a fake religion there, which became the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a religious system which allows, it's not a religious system, it's an irreligious system which allows Muslim to fight Muslim, and it has a Quran attached to it which matches the Armageddon Bible, and the Quran drops any sort of reasonable care for Jews and Christians. Now, this has been commented on by their own scholars. The reason I've changed the name to Hemphorism is because Hempher was an East India agent who planted this fake religion in Saudi Arabia in 1710, created occult lodges throughout the Middle East and spread it out in that particular kind of way. So you'll get people in Saudi Arabia who follow Wahhabism, and there may be perfectly genuine good people who take that on as their religion, and there's no way we want to get into discrimination and to attacking people's religions, but we can say something about a political movement. So I've called it Hemphorism.
Was the original Mr. Wahhab, was he an agent, or was he someone who was duped or seduced into starting the movement?
He was entirely duped. He was set up. he was told that the dreams he had and the visions he had meant that he was linked back to Muhammad and all of that kind of thing. It was an absolute hoax, and they led him along and fed him all this stuff. And the East India Company, which of course is part of the Lombard process, they used to do this all over the world to disturb a system or a religion and then set one side against another side. In this case, it led to the tragedy of World War One, although no doubt they had various profitable ventures before that. But the strategic war that came out of this was World War One. No, they led him along.
So you've got this Wahhab system set up in Saudi Arabia, which is basically to divide and conquer.
Absolutely correct. You've got in America, you've got the Christians being set up by Schofield. You've got Hempfer. In Israel, they're being set up by Rothschild and a number of rabbis. So, yes, you can see the thing beginning to form, where religions are intended to be the kind of thing that clashes. They're setting up for a future war. They're doing so 120 years before it is due to start. Not necessarily the big part of it, but before it is due to start.
So are there any more Armageddon plans?
Yes, indeed. There's a Shiite Armageddon. They've got something called the Bright Future Institute in Iran. It's a call centre so that people can ring up and find out when Armageddon is going to happen. And their prime minister is alleged to expect the return of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, and a final religious war and judgment to end the present world. And they think it's very close.
So was the Shiite Armageddon, was that actually set up by any of the lodges, or did that just come about?
It just happens to be there at the same time that all the other ones are forming, and we have no direct evidence to suggest how it was planted and how it is being maintained, but it's just thrown in because there's another one. And then the final sort of mix that I just need to end with is that £86 billion, not million, £billion pounds, was provided to spread the Saudi Hempferism of Mr. Wahhab, with millions of people being trained in madrasa-style schools who advocate jihad and war with the West. So all of these schools have suddenly sprung up on this enormous sum of money in a variety of different countries. We're not talking, of course, about Wahhabism, which can be somebody's faith. We're talking about a political movement. And I think there I can just sort of bring this little bit as this stage to an end.